welcome back to your favourite continent-spanning podcast, The Europeans. It's Katy in Paris.
And Dominic in Amsterdam. Hi, Katy.
How are you doing?
I'm fine. I just pulled another tick out of my cat's head. I want tick season to be over, okay?
Oh, I didn't know it had a season. That's fun.
Yeah, I think they don't like it when it's really cold. So that's the one thing I'm looking forward to about the cold weather.
Yay. I'm not looking forward to anything about the cold weather because it just means I'm going to continue being ill.
How are you doing?
Well, turns out that bad cold I had last week was pneumonia. So that's exotic and fun.
I'm so sorry. I hope the antibiotics are doing their work.
They are. I'm pleased to report that I am on the mend. And I've actually got a little something to share with you.
Oh?
So I had some unexpected news last week. My parents have started a podcast.
What?
Okay, that's not actually true, but it's kind of true. I can't remember if I told you that my mum is the proud owner of 2 chickens that live in her backyard.
I think you did once tell me about the chickens, yeah.
She's also a keen writer in her spare time, whereas my dad's hobby is feeding things into ChatGPT and other AI tools, if you can call that a hobby. Anyway, he thought he would test out Google's new tool, this thing called Notebook LM.
Oh, yeah.
Which allows you to turn anything into a podcast. And so he fed in this story that my mum wrote about life as a chicken owner. And he asked this Notebook LM thing to make a podcast about it. And I thought I'd play you a little clip of how this exciting collaboration from my parents turned out.
Using their voices?
No, using some generic AI voices. Do you want to hear it?
Oh, I'm intrigued, yeah.
Ever try reading a memoir written by a hen?
Sounds,
Get ready, because we're diving beak first into the world of Millie and her feathered friends.
It's a unique lens to explore, right? This isn't just about backyard chickens. It's about intelligence, social dynamics, and what we can learn from this unexpected source.
Yeah, it's amazing how much detail and humor Millie packs into her story. We're talking gourmet meal critiques and side-eye at the humans who think a bedtime story will keep them warm.
And that's just the beginning.
Whoa, it really sounds like a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
I find it really creepy that it refers to humans in the third person, like side-eye to the humans. Yeah, because you're not a human.
I mean, how worried do you think we should be about our jobs as podcasters?
Quite worried.
Clearly very worried. So it's funnily enough, just as we were going into this recording, our producer shared the sad news that an entire team of journalists at a local radio station in Krakow are losing their jobs because of AI replacing them.
Yeah, it's terrible.
So grim.
It's really grim. And also, yeah, weirdly impressive. And like, I just keep thinking, why? Like, why do we want the robots to do all these things for us? What have we got that's better to do?
Yeah.
And yeah, it just means that all the employment and all the money is going to go to a few tech billionaire individuals.
That is not something that we need to happen any more than it already is happening.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I don't feel like the robots that presented my parents' podcast have got quite as much emotional range as we do, if I do say so myself. So I don't think we're going to be out of a job tomorrow, but I am quite chilled by how good it is.
Yeah. What do your parents think of it?
They think we should just get rid of the Europeans tomorrow.
I appreciate that honest answer.
Anyway, maybe I should ask this thing to make another podcast about everything that we're talking about this week, because as usual, it's pretty varied. And I do want to know how AI deals with all the various tone shifts involved.
Maybe we could run a referendum after that. We could put out 2 episodes, one created by the AI bots and one created by us. And who knows? Although I'm feeling scared about referendums after the nail biter of a referendum that was in Moldova this week.
Oh my goodness. What a referendum. I mean, what was the final result?
Yeah, so they had a referendum about whether to join the EU or not. And 1.5 million people around that voted. And the yes camp won by just over 11,000 votes. So that's 50.38% of people voting yes. Ugh.
What a knife edge.
I guess a win is a win.
A win is a win, especially in the context where there seems to have been really quite significant Russian interference. So we'll take it.
We're not going to be talking about Moldova further today, but we will probably come back to it around the second round of the presidential election, which is on November the 3rd, where the pro-European incumbent Maia Sandu is running against a candidate backed by the pro-Russian Party of Socialists. So, yeah, we'll be keeping an eye on that. But this week, we're going to be stepping back into one of our favourite topics. You might remember that back in May 2023, we made an episode about a group of Swiss women, senior citizens, who were taking their government to court at the highest level, the European Court of Human Rights, for failing to do enough to prevent climate change. In a world first, the court ruled that Swiss inaction violated human rights. It was an extraordinary moment and one that led to huge celebration amongst many climate campaigners, but has led to a bit of disappointment since then in how the Swiss government have responded to it. Later on in the show, Katz Laszlo, our producer, is going to be joining Katy to talk to the human rights and climate change specialist, Seb Duyck. I can't wait to hear what he has to say. That's coming up later on in the show. But first, it's time for Good Week, Bad Week.
Good week, bad week.
Shall we start with Good Week? Who has had a good week, Katy?
First of all, a caveat. A lot of what I'm about to say is fairly depressing, so apologies in advance. I promise there will be something resembling a good week at the end of it. But I really want to talk about all of these signals that we got from European leaders over the past week, that we have really entered a new kind of era when it comes to the kind of migration policies that we can think of as being, quote unquote, mainstream. First of all, before I get into it, I want to give an honorary mention to Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk for probably the most jaw-dropping positioning of the week, in that Tusk has announced that he wants Poland to temporarily suspend the right to asylum.
Wow. Yeah, I think that's not really what people would have expected from someone who is apparently going to be this like centrist dad to come and save Poland.
Yeah, indeed. And it's certainly not legal under international law. Tusk didn't give any details about how Poland might do this legally. He came out with this rather startling announcement in response to the situation at Poland's border with Belarus. You might remember a couple of years ago that the regime in Belarus was deliberately sending Arab and African migrants to this border. Wojciech tells me that the situation there is quite murky these days in terms of what's going on. But Tusk's argument is basically that the right to asylum is being weaponized against Poland, and this extreme situation calls for an extreme response. So the context is complicated. But even so, for a centre-right politician like Tusk to be suggesting, maybe we could just suspend the right to asylum, I do think that's an indication of how the range of what is politically acceptable has changed in Europe. And in that vein, let's get on to the main thing I want to talk about, which is all of the enthusiasm among European leaders that we've seen this week about offshore migrant camps. I'm guessing you probably saw some of the headlines about this in relation to Italy over the weekend?
Yes, I did.
So a first batch of people were sent by Italy's far-right government to 2 such facilities in Albania last week. It's an arrangement that's been about a year in the making between Italy and Albania. And the general idea behind it is to take migrants who have been trying to cross the Mediterranean from Africa to Italy, and instead of taking them to the Italian mainland, where they want to claim asylum, you take them to Albania while their asylum claims are processed. And then they would either get approved, so that person would then be granted permission to travel to Italy, or they would be deported straight back to their home country. And you can see the appeal of this arrangement, right? Italy has been dealing with migrant arrivals for years and years and years. This is a nice, tidy solution that keeps the migrants off Italian soil, where nobody has to look at them, and it might even discourage them from making the trip to Europe in the first place. Do you see any issues with this?
Yes, I do. How would you make such a snap decision about whether it's safe for them to be sent back?
Well, this is one of the problems with it. Like, on a practical level, just things like access to lawyers for these people supposedly would have to be done mostly remotely. And that is like a huge problem when it comes to just making sure that these people actually get a fair hearing. I mean, generally it seems sort of vaguely gross to be reaching for a solution where we pay someone else to host these tiresome people who've had the audacity to try and escape from conflict and poverty in our nice, safe, rich part of the world. But yeah, on a practical level, even on EU soil, asylum seekers get mistreated all of the time. And when you outsource this process to a third country, it becomes even harder to monitor, right? So there is this problem with access to lawyers. It also becomes harder for rights groups to get access to these centres to make sure that people are being kept in decent enough conditions. It's not a new idea. We've seen how this works already. So the EU has already basically outsourced the management of some of its southern border. When you look at these deals that the EU has already made with the authorities in Libya and Tunisia, who are being paid to stop migrants from coming here, the scale of abuses against asylum seekers that have been documented in both of those countries, it is truly shocking. Women being raped, migrants being systematically robbed. The forces that carry out these abuses are being paid with our EU taxpayer money. But it feels a lot further away and not so much our responsibility because it is further away and it's much harder to monitor. And so, of course, Albania is not Libya or Tunisia. But ahead of actually opening these centres in Albania, Giorgia Meloni's far-right government were getting an avalanche of criticism over this plan from human rights groups and even from the UN's refugee agency about how it was actually going to work and what it would mean for the rights of people trying to claim asylum.
There was a similar plan in the UK under the last government to send asylum seekers to Rwanda. And that plan ended up having lots of stumbling blocks in the courts in the UK and has eventually been scrapped by the new British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. But it seems like all of these plans, I mean, there are differences in them, clearly, but they're all pretty controversial, but seem to be becoming more and more mainstream.
It's quite interesting that some defenders of the Italy initiative in Albania have compared it to Rwanda and said, oh, well, this is actually quite a lot more humane than that because what we're doing is sending people to be processed and they might end up with the right to live in Italy, which is quite different from the UK's Rwanda plan, which was to send people to live in Rwanda indefinitely. But you're right in saying that it's absolutely gone mainstream in the sense that none of the criticism that Meloni's government have had over this has stopped prominent European politicians from saying, oh, it sounds like Italy has actually a really interesting idea here. We might want to do this too. And one of them is the aforementioned Keir Starmer, the British Labour Prime Minister. He got a lot of criticism from within his own party after expressing a, quote, great interest in this policy. Another fan is Ursula von der Leyen. So she wrote a letter to EU leaders last week saying it was time for the EU to find innovative ways of tackling illegal migration and that she is in favour of the EU as a whole exploring the idea of setting up a slightly different type of camp outside the EU, not for detaining people who are still having their asylum claims processed, but for people who have already had an asylum claim rejected. And this would be part of a bid to speed up deportations, which is something that a lot of EU countries have been struggling with. I see that your government, Dominic, in the Netherlands, is floating the idea of sending rejected asylum seekers to Uganda.
Yeah, what can I say about the Dutch government and asylum policy? It's a big mess at the moment over here. And but it's the thing that the biggest party, the far-right PVV, are putting all their energy into. And it could be that the coalition falls because of it, but who knows?
There was a great quote from the Ugandan foreign minister on this. He seemed a bit baffled by the idea. He said he didn't think Uganda would agree to this deal, and he pointed out that Uganda has already given shelter to 1.6 million refugees from neighbouring African countries. And he said, we don't report any refugees. Why do European countries deport refugees? Which I think puts it into perspective just how crazy all of this looks from the perspective of much poorer countries that host the majority of the world's refugees. Anyway, the Netherlands is interested in this. Von der Leyen is interested in doing it too on an EU-wide scale. It's not clear where these camps would be. It's all kind of hypothetical. But von der Leyen said it was handy that with the start of the Italy-Albania deal, we'll also be able to draw lessons from this experience in practice.
Well, isn't the practice that the Italian plan in Albania has been stopped by the Italian courts?
Yeah, apparently if there is a lesson learned already, it's that what Italy was trying to do was illegal, at least in these specific circumstances. Basically, as soon as the first 16 men arrived in Albania, All of them were sent back to Italy. 4 of them because they were deemed to be too vulnerable, and the rest because an Italian court immediately ruled that them being there was not legal. It contradicted a recent ruling from the European Court of Justice. These men were all from Egypt and Bangladesh, which are on Italy's list of countries that it considers to be safe. But this ECJ ruling, it basically says that if any area of the country an asylum seeker is from is considered to be unsafe, you can't designate that country as safe. And that is the case of both Egypt and Bangladesh. So all of these men that had been sent at great expense on a military ship to Albania, it ended up costing 15,000 euros per person. They've all been sent back to Italy. And you can just imagine Giorgia Meloni's face when she heard the news. She's someone who quite often has a kind of murderous expression on her face. And she would have been absolutely hopping mad about this flagship policy of hers grinding to a halt. What happens now? It's kind of unclear. So the Meloni government has passed a new law that it certainly hopes will make these transfers to Albania less challengeable in the courts. Whether that will actually be the case remains to be seen. And whether this pretty early blow to Meloni's policy would affect whether or not this kind of offshore detainment facility gets rolled out by the wider EU also remains to be seen. Ursula von der Leyen's commission has been tasked by EU leaders with coming up with some kind of proposed new European migration law, specifically to make deportations of rejected asylum seekers faster. And in spite of this setback in Italy, it's still very possible that offshore centres could be a part of that proposal. I mean, she'd certainly find a lot of backing for that from governments like yours in the Netherlands. I just think it's worth flagging up what a turnaround this is for the European Commission. In 2018, the Commission did an assessment of the legality of these so-called return hubs. And at the time, it said that the idea presented significant legal and practical challenges, that it could violate asylum seekers' right not to be sent back to a country where they face danger. And it questioned whether the whole idea was compatible with EU values. But apparently times change.
Katy, wasn't this meant to be Good Week?
Yes, sorry, I'm getting there. I'm going to give my good week to Pedro Sánchez, the Prime Minister of Spain, because in the midst of all of this, not only has he called these offshore centres a complete waste of money, which they are, by the way. This policy is costing Italy 800 million euros.
Sorry, 800 million euros?
Yes, over 5 years.
But it just seems completely mad. I mean, couldn't they spend that money on helping process the asylum seekers in Italy and give them housing? I
mean, yeah, these are exactly the kind of arguments that were used with the Rwanda case in the UK, right? The whole thing was an incredibly costly exercise in what turned out to be political posturing in the end. Mm-hmm. But in general, Sanchez could not be talking more differently than other European leaders about migration right now. And I don't feel like he's getting as many headlines about this as he probably deserves. So earlier this month, he unveiled this plan to make it easier to migrate to Spain. And what I find really interesting about this is not that he presents this policy as something he believes in because it's moral. And he does do that. He's spoken very movingly about how 2 million Spaniards fled abroad during the Franco era, a lot of them by boat, and they sought safety elsewhere. But his argument is not primarily a moral one, it's an economic one. He has said very plainly that immigration will make Spain richer. It is a country with a declining birth rate. It needs labour. It needs construction workers and care workers and IT workers. And he's not apologising for making this argument. Spain has one of the fastest growing economies in the EU at the moment. And there was an OECD study out recently that pointed to the fact that Spain is filling gaps in its labour market with migrant labour as something that is helping it grow. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't want to make it sound like everything is rosy in Spain. Its own migration policy has come in for plenty of criticism in recent years, particularly when it comes to the treatment of migrants in Melilla. But given how insanely politically taboo it has become to talk about immigration as something positive, I find it quite amazing to hear a leading European politician talking like this. And it gives me the tiniest shred of hope.
I appreciate that you're giving Pedro Sánchez a bit of praise for doing things a bit differently, but I'm not sure really whether this can be counted as a good week.
Loads of negative context with a tiny little good week at the end. You're welcome.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move on. Who's had a bad week?
It's been a bad week for a bunch of rich people who were duped into buying fake bottles of vintage French wine by a criminal network.
Oh, no.
The rich individuals were paying up to 15,000 euros for these bottles.
Wow.
For wine that they thought was vintage French wine with the French protected designation of origin labeling, but was in fact cheap Italian plonk. Honestly, I don't know how bad the wine was that they put into these bottles. And I wish there was a way to be a fly on the wall and watch people opening these bottles of wine and seeing if they realized that it wasn't the expensive fine wine that they thought they had bought.
Because let's be honest, loads of those conversations are just nonsense, aren't they? You can imagine the waiter being like, if you taste this, monsieur, you would experience the delightful notes of apricot and plum, but it's all rubbish. No one knows what they're talking about.
Well, yeah, maybe not all rubbish. I think some fine wine is really tasty, but come on, 15,000 euros for a bottle. Oh, I can't help but feel that for people who are willing to spend that amount of money on a bottle of wine, they can also kind of afford to buy a few fakes without it causing them too much financial damage.
Is this the closest to a victimless crime that we've ever covered on this podcast?
Ooh, interesting. I don't know about that. I mean, it's difficult to know. We don't know who the individuals are. Maybe, I think a lot of people don't drink the wine. They're buying it as an investment. And maybe someone put their entire savings into one bottle thinking it was going to help them prepare for their retirement. I don't know. We don't know who the victims are. And I really don't want to make out that we're condoning the work of this fake vintage wine crime group.
Absolutely not.
It really doesn't seem to be a Robin Hood operation. They may be stealing from the rich, but there's absolutely no evidence that they are giving to the poor. And the reason why I'm talking about this wine fraud this week is because it was revealed that Europol, the law enforcement agency of the European Union, they busted this group of counterfeiters behind the operation.
Ah, interesting. So what do we know about these people? How big is this operation? How many people were involved in this gang of wine criminals?
There were 6 people who were arrested across Europe as part of this operation, including one Russian national who is a, quote, high-value target and is thought to be the ringleader. There were some reports that he was actually caught red-handed by the Italian police in Milan airport whilst carrying out a fraudulent transaction.
Red-handed, as in red wine all over his hands.
Oh, yeah, clever.
Thank you.
The sweep involved police in Italy, Switzerland, and France. It involved 14 house searches and the seizure of large quantities of counterfeited wine labelled as if they were from various Grand Cru domains. They also seized wine stickers, printers, wax products, technical machines to recap bottles, electronic equipment worth 1.4 million euros, and over 100,000 euros in cash. So it's not a small operation.
So it sounds from all of this equipment they had that it's not necessarily that easy a job faking a really fancy bottle of wine.
No, I think it really takes quite some skill to convince people that these bottles of wine were highly valuable vintage wine. Usually, these operations include some highly skilled artisans who are sharing their wine know-how to help the criminal operation. We know in this case that 2 of the Italians who were arrested were winemakers. Mm-hmm. Hugh Schofield, a BBC journalist, spoke to a wine auctioneer who said that the counterfeiting of old bottles and labels is so skillful these days that even the vineyards themselves are often unable to spot a fake. So, yeah, it is a difficult thing to get right, but it seems like some of these criminals are doing a really good job, and that makes it a very tricky thing to police. The attempts to shut down this criminal network in Europe dates back to more than a decade ago. Back in 2014, investigators discovered a latent trace, which I think in police terms it's like a faint bit of fingerprint on the back of one of the labels of one of these bottles of wine. That trace connected the wine bottle to a Russian individual from a previous investigation, and various arrests then took place over the past 10 years. But this time, I guess they hope that they've made a serious dent in the operations of this criminal network by seizing all these things and arresting all these people.
I want to watch a cop show about wine fraud and the dogged Europol agents who are tracking down these fraudsters.
It's actually a really good idea.
Someone commissioned that.
Get writing, Katy. And I think I should mention that like wine fraud isn't something that's new. Wine has been counterfeited since the beginning of wine, basically. But it does seem to be happening more and more, partly because the values of rare wines have exploded in recent years. So there is just much more money to be made for criminals who are able to do the counterfeiting well, especially because a lot of people buy these wines, as I said, as an investment, not necessarily to drink. But one thing that I was quite shocked to read is that it's not just the high-end wines that are counterfeited. Apparently, there have been cases of fake bottles of brands like Jacob's Creek being made.
That's like a €4.50 bottle of wine or something.
Know.
What's the point in that?
I really don't know. I mean, mainly it is high-end bottles, but I found it really weird to read that that has also happened. And something else that I was finding weird to think about was the fact that lots of people who have been duped with this high-end fake wines probably won't realize ever that they were duped. So I'm giving them bad week, but they may not know that they've had bad week because these wines seem to have been sold to customers via reputable, respected wine dealers who themselves didn't know. And Europol don't seem, at least online, to have published any information on how to check if your bottle is one that might have gone through this criminal network, or even which specific wines were being counterfeited. So, yeah. Maybe it's not such a bad week for these rich people. Maybe they can just live in ignorance and enjoy their privilege.
Yeah, it's funny, like as an adopted French person, I often feel quite self-conscious about how shamefully little I know about wine. And this story is kind of weirdly comforting to me because it makes me just think, you know what? Just drink it. And if you like it, you like it. And if you don't, you don't. And that's kind of all that matters. Unless you poured your life savings into it, in which case, uh-oh.
I think there'll probably be some wine connoisseurs listening who deeply disagree with you there.
Right in.
But I think the one thing I'm certain about is that us mere mortals should worry about other forms of fraud before we need to start getting too concerned about wine fraud.
Also, given that we're about to lose our jobs as podcasters because of AI, maybe this is a little sideline we could investigate, Dominic.
Wine fraud?
Yeah.
Okay.
I shouldn't be announcing that to the public.
No.
Forget I said anything.
Hope Europol isn't listening. Listeners, as we've discussed already today, we might be part of a dying breed of podcasts, not just because AI might be taking over, but because almost every podcast out there that isn't AI generated is either run by a major media corporation or fronted by celebrities. This podcast is hosted by two nobodies and
I was going to say, where are you going with this?
and is currently almost entirely listener funded. Is like almost a relic of the podcast industry of years past. But it's also an inspiring and hopeful model for what podcasting and journalism can be. We are so touched and inspired that we have listeners who care about what we are making enough to actually voluntarily donate and keep this podcast alive, even though it's not behind a paywall. And we're so happy that with that, we can retain our independence. So this is our weekly moment in the show where we shower you all with thanks. Not only the people that donate, but also the people who are listening and aren't in a position to donate at the moment. If you can part with a bit of your money, then please consider heading to patreon.com/Europeans podcast.
And the latest amazing people who have dug into their pockets and helped us to fund this podcast are Maria, Claudia, Stein, Alex, Rika, and also to Luke and Durham for increasing their donations. Thank you all so, so, so much. So, listeners, if you've been listening to the Europeans for a while, you will know that we've been kind of obsessed over the past couple of years with this court case at the European Court of Human Rights, the KlimaSeniorinnen case. If you haven't heard it already, I can highly recommend going back and listening to our episode that we made that explains this court case. It's called The Biggest Climate Case That Ever Was, an award-winning episode. plug. And then we also did a follow-up back in April that talks about what this court actually ruled that Switzerland had to do. You'll find the links in these show notes. But for those of you who want to just go right ahead and listen to the interview that we have this week, Katz is here, producer Katz, to give us a small recap. Hi, Katz.
Hi, Katz.
Hi, nice to be on the show. Yes, absolutely. So a recap. So this was the first climate case that was heard by the European Court of Human Rights. And it was a case where a group of older Swiss women, the KlimaSeniorinnen, took their own government to court, arguing that their government was failing to protect them from climate change. And so the first big question around this case was, would the judges decide that minimizing climate change, whether that is something that falls under human rights law or not? And the court decided that yes, human rights law does include countries having to actively minimize climate change to protect their citizens from harm. And then they ruled that the Swiss climate policy was not meeting its human rights obligations, and so they needed to write a new climate policy. Not only that, but they needed to set intermediate goals along the way. So they can't just do what a lot of countries are doing and say, yes, in 2040 or 2050, we'll have stopped emitting carbon.
Yeah. Stop breathing down our necks about it. It's going to be fine.
Exactly. Not only that, the court also ruled that Switzerland doesn't measure well enough what their emissions are or publicize those. And so Switzerland is going to have to start doing that so they can provide evidence to the court that they are meeting their own goals. But it is up to Switzerland to decide how it reduces its emissions. Now, Switzerland would have to report all of this to the Committee of Ministers, which is all of the Council of Europe's foreign ministers or their representatives in Strasbourg. And that Committee of Ministers would sit down and review if Switzerland's new policy was enough and whether Switzerland had provided enough evidence.
Okay, so that's where we left off, Switzerland being handed a bunch of homework by the court. And now we're going to hear how Switzerland responded to getting all of this homework. Katz and I did that this week with the help of someone who knows this case extremely well, Seb Duyck. He is a climate attorney at the Centre for International Environmental Law in Geneva, Switzerland. How did the Swiss government actually respond when it was told to do all of this stuff?
The Swiss government throughout the process, already before the judgment, had an extremely strong negative response to the process, and it had also a very strong negative response to the judgment. The main response that the Swiss government gave was that it was legally wrong to assume that governments could be held accountable under the European Convention of Human Rights for their lack of climate action, and also that it believed that it was doing sufficiently with very limited evidence that it does. And it was delivered also in a rather aggressive manner, so not the traditional, more diplomatic tone that you would expect from governments' responses to the court judgment.
Yeah, I read that the parliament voted to remind the court of its mandate, which sounded pretty sassy. The main critique I've seen from politicians, both Swiss and abroad, which you already mentioned a bit, is that it's, quote, undemocratic for the court to get involved in political issues. And I'm wondering what you would say to that. Do you also consider it undemocratic?
No, absolutely not. That's exactly the role of the court. And the court actually is very careful in its judgment. It's a 260 pages long judgment. So it really gets into the specifics. What the court reminds the Swiss government is the role of the legislature and of the government to enact and implement policies. And this is their responsibility. What the judges do is to make sure that these comply with overarching legal norms, to make sure that a minority, whether it is the present generation towards future generation or a particular political minority, cannot actually override some of the norms that really establish the foundation of democratic societies. And so here, this is what the court does. It reviews whether the actions that have been enacted and implemented by the Swiss government are sufficient. And as it finds that it is not the case, it reminds the Swiss government that it will be its responsibility to define which action is necessary, but it requires that the Swiss government propose a plan that makes sense all in all from a legal perspective and actually delivers sufficient climate action. And so this kind of question comes not just in climate justice cases, but also in all other cases. National governments are responsible for choosing and implementing policies, but then judges are there to make sure that fundamental norms such as human rights are respected.
So it seems like we're in this kind of deadlock where the court has said, Switzerland, you're not doing enough. You have to come up with a new climate policy. And then the Council of Europe's Committee of Ministers, I think it will be their job to decide whether or not this new Swiss policy is enough. And Switzerland have responded, no, we get to decide whether what we're doing is enough. And we think we're doing a pretty good job. What happens now? Like, what can actually be done to break this deadlock?
Now, what will happen is that the Committee of Ministers, so it's all 46 member states of the Council of Europe, will be responsible to supervise the execution of a judgment by Switzerland. Switzerland submitted its report, and as you said that basically there is nothing more to be seen. It's doing enough. Now, the Committee of Ministers is going to use the judgment as a blueprint and actually fact-check the Swiss response. And we believe that the Swiss response is so clearly failing to respond to the actual substantive demands of the court that it should be relatively easy for the Committee of Ministers to actually demand more of Switzerland. Switzerland did not even really try to make the argument this time. It basically played more to the domestic crowd that are frustrated with what is described in Switzerland as foreign judges. And so hopefully other states in the Committee of Ministers will come back and remind Switzerland that it has to engage in good faith and to really go to the bottom of the arguments and not just send political messages for its domestic audiences.
In the scenario where Switzerland maintains this position, like where they continue to reject it, are there any kind of tools, like obviously the court doesn't have any police, but would it be fines? Would it be up to the other countries in the Council of Europe to enforce it? Are there any specific tools?
So there are no fines or sanctions. And what's interesting to see is that in terms of like the recommendation on how Switzerland has to execute the judgment, this is by the Committee of Ministers, so by other states and not by the court. The court has done its job. It delivered an analysis of the law. And so the escalation that might come in case Switzerland really reject the recommendations that will come in spring, they involve primarily diplomatic tools and peer pressure among states. Now, Switzerland is a country that depends very significantly on the goodwill of other states, on multilateralism, and it's clearly not in Switzerland's interest to actually undermine multilateralism. And this is why we believe that the Committee of Ministers actually does have some weight to really ensure that Switzerland behave as a reasonable actor in this case, and also actually do right for its own population, because at the end of the day, this is what is requested of Switzerland, is to protect the rights of its own population. And hopefully Swiss people will also lose patience with a government that denies the need for it to adopt measures that will protect their rights and the rights of future generations of Swiss people.
Has anything like this ever happened before at the European Court of Human Rights? Are there any previous examples of what happens when you have a government like this, a state like this, that's kind of refusing to do the court's bidding?
Unfortunately, it's not without precedent. I will say it is very surprising this time coming from a government like Switzerland that really speaks highly about its commitment to human rights and relies on European institutions to exist more strongly in international affairs. But it is not fully without precedent. And so there are a lot of judgments for which it takes quite some back and forth for other countries to actually provide the pressure, the incentives for the government to take the court's judgments seriously. With Switzerland, we really expect that it will not lower itself to the standard that other states like Azerbaijan or Turkey have set in terms of how you denounce the role of the European Court of Human Rights.
One of the reasons this case was such big news was that if Switzerland has to be more ambitious, then it meant that all of the other countries in Europe would also have to be more ambitious, or they would risk having a case started by their citizens and losing. And I'm wondering, following this historic win in climate litigation, have we seen other governments make their climate policy more ambitious, sort of preventatively to avoid a case?
That's a great question. And actually, like what's important here to keep in mind is the fact that Switzerland is not the first case to actually be judged as needing to increase its ambition because of human rights obligation. What happened in the other countries is that the national courts, in the Netherlands, in France, in other countries, Germany, Ireland, Belgium, those national courts have already made similar judgments, sometimes based also on human rights. What is novel with the KlimaSeniorinnen case is that the European Court of Human Rights had to step in to make this case because of the failure of Swiss courts to take the arguments seriously enough. And whether European governments have changed their policy because of KlimaSeniorinnen. I think it's too early to say because it's a relatively new judgment, but definitely other governments have reacted and increased their ambition based on their own national cases. And we know it's a strong also incentive for governments that are not yet the target of judicial action, but knowing that actually all of those cases, KlimaSeniorinnen, but also the other ones, they set precedents that might come to haunt them unless they actually do the right thing at the end of the day and protect their population from climate impacts by cutting emissions sufficiently.
You have described Switzerland's response to all of this as a failure to embrace science-based climate action. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that? How is it a rejection of science?
The Swiss are basically arguing that they are doing enough, and this is all based on their own targets and their own emission pathways. But what climate models show, and there are different independent analyses, is that the Swiss targets are nowhere sufficient in order to actually prevent the most dangerous changes in the climate. Basically, with targets like the Swiss target, the one that the Swiss government right now claims is sufficient, we will not have significant chances of keeping temperatures below 1.5 degrees.
One of the main arguments I saw against Switzerland was that Switzerland is using more than its fair share. And just for a very simplified explanation, we can calculate how much we as a planet are able to emit before we go above 1.5 degrees. And so they just divided that up per capita. And based on that number, Switzerland will already have used up all of the carbon it has left using its current policies by 2034. And so the lawyers of KlimaSeniorinnen, they made this argument that since it will continue to emit carbon, it will be committing carbon theft. It's quite a complicated idea, but also really eye-opening. I'm wondering, how is Switzerland responding to that? Is this idea of carbon theft catching on in climate litigation?
I think failure to do its fair share, that's clearly one of the main arguments in most climate litigation. Carbon theft is a great way to explain to the wider audiences what this is actually about. Switzerland is among the countries with the greatest gap between what the government claims in its target, in its policies, and what it actually does in terms of regulating the actual footprint of the country's economy. And this includes both failing to adopt high enough targets that are in line with the science in relation to keeping temperatures below 1.5 degrees with sufficient chances of achieving that target. It fails to consider also sufficiently other forms of responsibility or footprint that the Swiss economy and the Swiss population have on the global carbon budget, including, for instance, the emissions related to consumption, the emissions related to the higher share of international travel that Swiss population has compared to other population. And in particular, also, it fails to take into account the fact that Swiss financial actors, both public and private, actually contribute enormously to emissions in other countries by investment and insurance.
Moving away from talking about governments for a second to thinking about companies, you often see these crazy statistics that like 100 companies in the planet bear the bulk of the responsibility for climate change. And alongside these groundbreaking cases that we've seen where states have been taken to court over climate change, there are now also these cases of big companies like Shell being taken to court based on the same kind of human rights law. What do you think is the future of climate litigation against companies?
I think this is definitely something that can only be expected to grow. It will grow until those companies actually adopt a business model and a behavior that is in line with what science is clearly telling us is inadequate. And so I think we can expect two forms of litigation moving forward. One that targets governments for the lack of effective regulation of private actors, not just the need to set targets, but also to make sure that private companies operating under the jurisdiction cannot continue to actually disregard the need for us to tackle the climate urgency. And then the second category of cases would be cases directly targeted towards corporations, as you mentioned. There is actually one such case in Switzerland at the moment that is pending against one of those 70 largest emitters, which is the cement producer Holcim, We have Pacific Islanders denouncing the fact that the operation of this company is in breach with legal standards and impacts their rights. And we have seen in other countries, including in Europe, an increasing number of law cases actually targeted towards some of those major polluters. And so that's something that we can only expect to increase as people grow more aware of the impact of these companies' operations on their life.
Thank you so much to Seb for joining us. He actually does some really excellent tweeting about climate litigation. So if that's something that you're interested in understanding a bit better, I really recommend following him. You can find him on the platform, now known as X, at DUYCKS.
Yeah, he really does tweet excellently. Twitter, which I refuse to call X, is a platform that I almost entirely avoid. But this is the only thing that I read about on there. And one of the things I read while looking through his profile was a dialogue between a few different people about how it's a responsibility of the governments and also journalists to help their citizens understand what democracy is, which is both the parliament and the courts. And the argument was that both journalism and governments are failing in that instead of teaching their citizens what democracy is, they're just questioning the rule of law and what the purpose of these courts are.
Right.
The courts are there to protect our human rights, and that those human rights aren't just something that we can vote on and that can really change depending on who is in power that term. And yeah, I think now we're trying to figure out how climate change fits into those human rights. I think we're still going to be figuring that out for a long time. But one thing is clear, climate litigation is here to stay, and we will be paying attention to it on the show for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, there's a big Greenpeace case coming in the Netherlands that I'm very excited about.
Ooh. Watch this space.
Thanks, Kat.
Bye, guys.
Dominic Kramer, what have you been enjoying this week? Last time you said, I said, what have you been enjoying this week in a really bored way? So that's me trying to do it enthusiastically.
You did sound much more enthusiastic.
Ta-da!
I'm currently reading Swimming in the Dark, a really excellent Polish novel by Tomasz Jędrowski, translated into English by Robert Sudół. It's a beautifully written gay love story set in the closing days of the Polish People's Republic. I'm about halfway through, and it is completely melting my heart. It was published back in 2020, not long after Polish towns started declaring LGBT-free zones, which was like a very dark time for LGBTQ plus people in Poland. And I'm pleased to be reading it in 2024 when things are at least a little bit better for queer people in Poland now that the Law and Justice Party are out of government and all those so-called LGBT-free zones have been repealed. Anyway, I really recommend it. It's called Swimming in the Dark by Tomasz Jędrowski.
I've heard nothing but good things about that book. I really want to read it too.
What have you been enjoying, Katy?
I want to recommend a graphic novel. I've probably talked about this before on the podcast, but I genuinely don't understand why graphic novels aren't mainstream in the English-speaking world in the same way that they are in the French-speaking world. Like, it's changing a little bit, but I think they're still kind of seen as a bit niche or like a form of book that's associated with comics and superheroes. When in French, graphic novels are like a huge part of the mainstream literary scene. There are like blockbuster releases. You can get serious journalistic investigations that have been produced in graphic novel form. And I find it a really fun way to absorb information and learn. Is that true in Dutch as well? Or are graphic novels also seen as not super mainstream over there in the Netherlands?
I don't really know. It's not a form that I've personally got much interest in.
Not yet. We haven't read this one yet. I wanted to recommend the graphic novel World Without End. And it's a translation from a French graphic novel called Le Monde Sans Fin. It was co-written by a cartoonist, Christophe Blain, and a very well-known French climate expert called Jean-Marc Jancovici. And this book was a huge hit in France. It is credited with changing the way that many people in France think about climate change, because it walks you through our addiction to fossil fuels in a way that I haven't really thought about before. Like, you might think that you know the basics of climate change because we get bombarded with messaging about our impending doom all of the time. Mm-hmm. But in terms of thinking about like the economy that we've built and things like what a kilowatt hour of energy is, like, I don't think about that stuff very often. I certainly haven't previously thought about that stuff at all. And the way that this book talks you through all of that is really engaging. This book is funny in a way that most books about climate change really are not funny. And if you heard our interview with Andrew Magnuson a couple of weeks back, you'll know that how to talk about climate change in a way that doesn't make people just blank out and switch off is something that's on our minds a lot here at the Europeans. So I'm pleased to report that this book is really one of those examples of good communication about climate change, in that it really will make you think differently. I can't say it made me feel good, and it's certainly not a perfect book. The French version was a huge hit, but it certainly had its critics for various things, including coming out in favor of nuclear, which anti-nuclear people didn't like very much at all. But I learned a lot from this book, and it did make me laugh. You're kind of on a journey along with the cartoonist in trying to figure out what to do with his climate anxiety. And he's come up with such imaginative ways to visualize these things that can seem so abstract. So I really recommend this book. It has been very amusingly translated by Edward Gauvin. And I was lucky enough to have been sent a copy by the publisher ahead of its release in English, which is today, I think, Thursday. So if you find it in your bookshop, it is well worth a look.
Okay, my graphic novel skepticism is slowly melting. I'm actually thinking I might buy this for my husband for Christmas.
Oh, well, he'll like it, even if you don't.
I hope he's not listening.
Stop listening, Thomas.
For my happy ending this week, I'm putting on my sports correspondent hat once again.
It's my favourite hat that you have.
I don't know quite how it became my hat, but here we are. The happy sports news this week comes from the soccer world, where Croatian midfielder Luka Modrić made history last week by becoming the oldest player to play for Real Madrid in the club's history.
He's a pensioner. Wait, how old is he?
He is 39 years and 40 days old.
Ancient.
He beat the record of Hungarian forward Ferenc Puskás, who played his final match with Real Madrid in 1966 at the age of 39 years and 37 days. And I have to say, as I move past the middle of my 30s, it makes me very happy when I hear of sports people achieving things at a slightly older age. And Modrić not only played, but he really proved his continuing relevance for the club as he set up the winning goal for his team. I believe they call that an assist, right?
Sure. I don't have a sports hat, so you're on your own here.
Modrić is considered to be one of the greatest midfielders of all time and possibly the best Croatian footballer of all time. He's now 39, but there is actually some speculation that he might even make it to play in the World Cup in 2026, which would be quite extraordinary. Anyway, happy news for Modrić and for Real Madrid, who have had this incredible player on their team for 13 seasons already.
Wow.
Here's to more old people doing sport.
Thank you, Modrić. You are an inspiration to all of us creeping towards 40.
That's all we've got time for this week, but you can check us out on all the social media there is out there, where we will be tweeting and Instagramming without any help from AI.
For now, yeah, next week, the Europeans, brought to you in the 100% AI format by Google Notebook LM.
I hope not.
No. I'm pleased to tell you that this podcast will remain hosted by humans for the foreseeable future, and we will be back next week as humans with another concoction of fun and miserable stories from across the continent.
The real people who produced this episode are Kat Laszlo and Wojciech Oleksiak. Thank you both so much.
Thank you, humans, and thank you, other humans, for listening. We'll see you next week.
Goodbye.